Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. I am reading you Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which is the story of a pitched civil war in a cathedral town called Barchester between the forces of the new bishop, Dr. Proudie, and his wife and his oily, manipulative chaplain, Obadiah Slope, and the entrenched forces of the town, the ecclesiastical orders of the town. Barchester is a cathedral town, and most of our major characters are employed in one way or another by the cathedral. It's a vast bureaucracy of people who don't have to work for a living and who get the rich pickings that the cathedral has to offer. And Mr. Slope wants to control that machinery. The new bishop does, but Mr. Slope does as well, and maybe not in exactly the same ways. Mr. Slope is looking out for himself. He says he's looking out for the pride and dignity of his master, the bishop, but he's really looking out for himself. And he has a great opportunity to do that by a little plot twist that Trollope throws in right around this time, which is that the dean of Barchester, a very powerful role in the church bureaucracy, has been struck with apoplexy and is currently hovering between life and death. He is Schrodinger's dean, as one of you put it. He is neither alive nor dead. But the fact that he is not going to make a recovery has made everyone start to think, well, who's going to replace him? He can't live forever like this. Someone will have to replace him. And it's made Mr. Slope think that maybe that someone should be him. Even though he has no background, no family, no propriety, he's not a gentleman. All that he has is influence, juice, we would say today. He knows an important editorial writer at the Jupiter, the massively influential paper in London. He knows a politician. And he also has the bishop under his thumb, or at least would like to think that he does. Control for the bishop is something that he is fighting for with Mrs. Proudie. And although they have been allies, he's been a loyal toady of hers for years, they have recently declared opposition to each other. The bishop received an invitation from the archbishop to go to the archbishop's palace for a visit, and the invitation did not extend to Mrs. Proudie. Mrs. Proudie therefore said, "You will not go." And Obadiah Slope thought it would be a good idea if you went. He originally wanted it to do it in order to break the bishop from the control of his wife and put him more completely under the control of Slope himself. But then this deanery thing came up. And, well, a recommendation from the archbishop in the right ears in London would certainly go a long way towards getting the position for Mr. Slope. So he convinces the bishop to go to the archbishop with that in mind. Raise it. Bring my name up. I'm sure if your lordship did such a thing, I would be a shoo-in. And that's where we left things here, with the one other plot being Mrs. Eleanor Bold, the daughter of the previous warden of a charitable hospital in Barchester, who, as we have seen, has been the heart of contention in most of the book, because Mr. Slope sent her an inopportune letter that became known. It was a greasy, oily letter. It presumed too much. Eleanor Bold was the first person to know that it presumed too much. It presumed too great a familiarity. But even so, Eleanor doesn't like the way all the people on the cathedral side of Barchester are just aligned against this man. She doesn't know anything wrong about him. She doesn't like him. He's uncouth. But she doesn't see that he's the great enemy, and she doesn't see why she should be browbeaten into thinking of him that way, just because all the churchmen in her life think of him that way. So that resentment, plus her dawning awareness that all of her friends and family think that she intends to marry Mr. Slope when nothing could be further from her mind, infuriates her. She was spending a wonderful time at Archdeacon Grantley's country house, Plumstead Episcopi, including in the company of Mr. Arabin, a churchman who Dr. Grantley brought into Barchester specifically to vie with Mr. Slope. They had been getting along quite well, Mr. Arabin and Eleanor Bold. They are, by a wide margin, the two most interesting and most worthy people in the book. Trollope tends to match those up, or give us a tragedy in which they fail to match up. Mr. Arabin joining in this suspicion of Eleanor is the worst possible thing to him. She hates that more than anything. So that's where we are right now with a chapter called Mrs. Proudie Victrix. which will give readers a hint of what's coming. And although Mrs. Prouty is loud and bossy and domineering and not at all charitable, Trollope has a way with characters like her. Every once in a while, about every 3 books, there's a character like her that is a god emperor. They're the ultimate autocrat. And Trollope has a way of making you root for them. I don't know how he does it, but I don't think when people who were reading this as a periodical, as these chapters were appearing, when they saw the chapter Mrs. Prouty Victrix, I'd be willing to bet there wasn't one of them that didn't jump into this thing, maybe put off supper to read this chapter. So let's see how she turns out to be victorious. It's not going to be hard. In fact, we've already seen the moment of her victory, only we didn't see it. Slope has control over the bishop, gets him to go and accept the archbishop's invitation. But as we're told, as Trollope tells us, that control doesn't extend to the bishop's bedroom. Sooner or later, the bishop has to light his candle and ascend the stairs to his bedroom, where there is no Mr. Slope, where there is only his wife. And Trollope tells us in the last chapter, he did that the night of their argument, and I'm not going to show you that scene. Some scenes shouldn't be shown. But the next morning, the bishop comes down to breakfast looking like he's aged 30 years. He's walking like an infirm man. He has obviously had the riot act read to him and had his will thoroughly broken. But let's see how things are going. The next week passed over at Barchester with much apparent tranquility. The hearts, however, of some of the inhabitants were not so tranquil as the streets of the city. The poor old dean still continued to live, just as Sir Omicron Pye had prophesied that he would do, much to the amazement, and some thought disgust, of Dr. Filgrave. The bishop still remained away. He had stayed a day or two in town, and had also remained longer at the archbishop's than he had intended. Mr. Slope had as yet received no line in answer to either of his letters, but he had learnt the cause of this. Sir Nicholas was stalking a deer, or tending the Queen in the Highlands, and even the indefatigable Mr. Towers had stolen an autumn holiday, and had made one of the yearly tribe who now ascend Mont Blanc. Mr. Slope learnt that he was not expected back till the last day of September. So Mr. Slope wrote letters to a politician and to that editorial writer in support of his cause to be made dean. But his support is not around. They aren't attending to it. They're off. That's very, very dicey. Especially since we don't know how long the dean is going to be, Schrodinger's dean. We don't know how long he's not going to live. Mrs. Bold was thrown much with the Stanhopes, of whom she became fonder and fonder. This is the family of Dr. Vesey Stanhope, a clergyman in Barchester, who is told by Obadiah Slope, you had better come back from Italy, where he's been for years, drawing his full salary from the church, but never doing his duties. He's raised his whole family there, his 3 children. Charlotte, Signora Neroni, who is his lame daughter who married an Italian who's nowhere around. She's the beautiful temptress that we saw in the last chapter. And also Bertie Stanhope, the boy who's weird and has a long beard and airy, bright blue eyes and weird clothing, and is totally hopeless. He's just totally hopeless. He has grown up with the indolence of the son of a lord, when actually he's the son of a church officiary who has put no money aside for him. So he needs to marry money. And much like Obadiah Slope, he has his eyes on Eleanor Bold. Let's see here. If asked, she would have said that Charlotte Stanhope was her especial friend, and so she would have thought. It's not true. But to tell the truth, she liked Bertie nearly as well. She had no more idea of regarding him as a lover than she would have had of looking at a very big, tame dog in such a light. Bertie had become very intimate with her and made little speeches to her and said little things of a sort very different from the speeches and sayings of other men. But then he was almost always done before his sisters, and he, with his long silken beard, his light blue eyes, his strange dress, was so unlike other men. She admitted him to a kind of familiarity that she had never known with anyone else, and of which she was by no means understood the danger. She blushed once at finding that she had called him Bertie, and on the same day only barely remembered her position in time to check herself from playing upon him some personal practical joke to which she was instigated by Charlotte. Charlotte is doing this for a reason. Remember what Trollope has told us about the Stanhopes, all of them. But they aren't real. Trollope didn't use the term, but basically he's saying they're a family of sociopaths. In all this, Eleanor was perfectly innocent, and Bertie Stanhope could hardly be called guilty. But every familiarity into which Eleanor was entrapped was deliberately planned by his sister. She knew how well to play her game, and played it without mercy. She knew, none so well, what her brother's character was, and she would have handed over to him the young widow and the young widow's money and the young widow's child without remorse. With her pretended friendship and warm cordiality, she strove to connect Eleanor so closely with her brother as to make it impossible that she should go back, even if she wished to. But Charlotte Stanhope knew really nothing of Eleanor's character, did not even understand that there were such characters. She did not comprehend that a young and pretty woman could be playful and familiar with a man such as Bertie Stanhope, and yet have no idea in her head, no feeling in her heart, that she would have been ashamed to own to all the world. Charlotte Stanhope did not in the least conceive that her new friend was a woman whom nothing could entrap into an inconsiderate marriage, whose mind would have revolted from the slightest impropriety had she been aware that any impropriety existed. It's not that Charlotte thinks that she can overcome that. It's that she is so deficient herself that she doesn't even know such people could exist. Sorry, one of you pointed out that it took longer for me to read the last chapter out loud than it did for them to read it to themselves. That's because of all these interruptions. But I have long since made my peace with the fact that I cannot stop editorializing when we do these read-alongs. I cannot stop myself from doing that. I can't leave it to a few comments at the end. This is not going to be a normal read-along. This would make a very poor audiobook. Just have to make our peace with that. Miss Stanhope, however, had tact enough to make herself and her father's house very agreeable to Mrs. Bold. There was with all of them an absence of stiffness and formality which was peculiarly agreeable to Eleanor after the great dose of clerical arrogance which she had lately been constrained to take. She played chess with them, walked with them, and drank tea with them, studied or pretended to study astronomy, assisted them in writing stories in rhyme, in turning prose tragedy into comic verse, or comic stories into would-be tragic poetry. She had no idea before that she had any such talents. She could not have conceived the possibility of her doing such things as she did now. She found with the Stanhopes new amusements and new enjoyments, new pursuits, which in themselves could not be wrong, and which were exceedingly alluring. Is it not a pity that people who are bright and clever should so often be exceedingly improper, and that those who are never improper should so often be dull and heavy? Irony much, Tony? And now Charlotte Stanhope was always bright and never heavy, but then her propriety was doubtful. But during all this time, Eleanor by no means forgot Mr. Arabin, nor did she forget Mr. Slope. She had parted from Mr. Arabin in her anger. She was still very angry at what she regarded as his impertinent interference, but nevertheless she looked forward to meeting him again and also looked forward to forgiving him. The words that Mr. Arabin had uttered still sounded in her ears. She knew that if not intended for a declaration of love, they did signify that he loved her. And she felt also that if he ever did make such a declaration, it would be that she would not receive it unkindly. She was still angry with him, very angry with him, so angry that she would bite her lip and stamp her foot as she thought of what he had said and done. But nevertheless, she yearned to let him know that he was forgiven. All that she required was that he should own that he had sinned. And he has sinned. He's stubborn. He refuses to admit that. Says that he's done nothing wrong. But anyway. She was to meet him at Ullathorne. We met the Ullathornes in an earlier chapter. They are local grandees. And Miss Ullathorne, the lady of the house, is a hilarious figure because of her idolization of the distant past. Anything that's old is good for her, and anything that's new is not. She was to meet him at Ullathorne on the last day of the present month. Miss Thorne had invited all the country round to a breakfast on the lawn. There were to be tents and archery and dancing for the ladies on the lawn, and for the swains and girls in the paddock. There were to be fiddlers and fifers, races for the boys, poles to be climbed, ditches full of water to be jumped over, horse collars to be grinned through. Though this latter amusement was an addition of the stewards and not arranged by Miss Thorne in the original program, and every game to be played which, in a long course of reading, Miss Thorne could ascertain could have been played in the good days of Queen Elizabeth. On this one subject, Miss Thorne was very unhappy because, of course, one of the foremost entertainments of the Elizabethan era is something that Miss Thorne's poor, loving heart cannot countenance. On one subject, Miss Thorne was very unhappy. She had been turning in her mind the matter of a bull ring, but could not succeed in making anything of it. She would not for the world have done, or allowed to be done, anything that was cruel. As to the promoting of the torture of a bull for the amusement of her young neighbors, it hardly need be said Miss Thorne would be the last to think of it. And yet there was something so charming in the name, A bull ring, however, without a bull would only be a memento of the decadence of the times, and she felt herself constrained to abandon the idea. Quintains, that is, jousting at targets, however, she was determined to have, and had poles and swivels and bags of flour prepared accordingly. She would no doubt have been anxious for something small in the way of a tournament, but as she said to her brother, that had been tried, and the age had proved too decidedly inferior to its forerunners to admit of such a pastime. Mr. Thorne did not seem to participate much in her regret, feeling perhaps that a full suit of chain armor would have added but little to his own personal comfort. You have to wonder, at Ullathorne Court, are there suits of armor? Maybe as decorations in the hallways, but that were once used in Elizabethan times? This party at Ullathorne had been planned, in the first place, as a sort of welcoming to Mr. Arabin on his entrance into St. Ewold's parsonage. An intended harvest home gala for the laborers and their wives and children had subsequently been amalgamated with it, and thus it had grown to its present dimensions. All the Plumstead party had of course been asked, and at the time of the invitation Eleanor had intended to have gone with her sister. Now her plans were altered, and she was going with the Stanhopes. The Proudies were also to be there, and as Mr. Slope had not been included in the invitation to the palace, the Signora, that is Madeline Neroni, whose impudence never deserted her, had asked permission of Miss Thorne to bring him. Okay, so we're going to go on with the chapter, but there's a huge gathering in the air, right? Let's not forget that. Trollope drops hints about these things ahead of time so that you can look forward to them. All of our principals are going to be gathered on the lawn at Ullathorne. But not in this chapter. Let's see what we have to go on. This permission Miss Thorne gave, and having no other alternative, but she did so with a trembling heart, fearing Mr. Arabin would be offended. Immediately on his return, she apologized, almost with tears. So dire an enmity was presumed to range between the two gentlemen. But Mr. Arabin comforted her by an assurance that he should meet Mr. Slope with the greatest pleasure imaginable, and made her promise that she would introduce them to each other. They've never met. These two opponents, who've been vying in editorial spaces, have never met in person. But this triumph of Mr. Slope's was not so agreeable to Eleanor, who since her return to Barchester had done her best to avoid him. She would not give way to the Plumstead folk when they so ungenerously accused her of being in love with this odious man, but nevertheless, knowing that she was so accused, she was fully alive to the expediency of keeping out of his way and dropping him by degrees. She had seen very little of him since her return. Her servant had been instructed to say to all visitors that she was out. She would not bring herself to specify Mr. Slope particularly, and in order to avoid him, she had thus debarred herself from all her friends. She had accepted Charlotte Stanhope, and by degrees a few others. Once she had met him at the Stanhopes, but as a rule, Mr. Slope's visits there were made in the morning, and hers in the evening. On that one occasion, Charlotte had managed to preserve her from any annoyance. This was very good-natured on the part of Charlotte, as Eleanor thought, and also very sharp-witted, as Eleanor had told her friend nothing of her reason for wishing to avoid the gentleman. Eleanor thinks that Charlotte is just really perceptive. Charlotte has her own reasons, obviously. The fact, however, was that Charlotte had learned from her sister that Mr. Slope was probably put forward as a suitor for the widow's hand, and she was consequently sufficiently alive to the expediency of guarding Bertie's future wife from any danger in that quarter. Nevertheless, the Stanhopes were pledged to take Mr. Slope with them to Ullathorne. An arrangement was therefore necessarily made, which was very disagreeable to Eleanor. Dr. Stanhope, and herself, and Charlotte, and Mr. Slope were to go together, and Bertie was to follow with his sister Madeline. It was clearly visible by Eleanor's face that this arrangement was very disagreeable to her, and Charlotte was so much encouraged thereby in her own little plan, made 1,000 apologies. Notice some verbal repetitions here. Very much disagreeable, by degrees, very alive to. You sometimes wonder, I sometimes wonder, you don't, of course, because you're sane. I sometimes wonder at the conditions of Trollope writing his chapters. We've been told, he tells us disastrously in his autobiography, strips the curtain right off the writing process, and says that he would write so-and-so many words per quarter hour for 2 hours every day. And that makes it sound very regular, but of course no day is exactly like any other day. He's ordinarily more careful than this about lazily repeating words, especially in the same paragraph. It makes me wonder under what condition these pages were written. But anyway, there's another one of those interruptions. So let's go on here. I see you don't like it, my dear, said Charlotte, but we would not manage otherwise. Bertie would give his eyes to go with you, but Madeline cannot possibly go without him. Madeline is crippled, badly crippled, can't walk. She needs help to get from place to place. Nor could we possibly put Mr. Slope and Madeline in the same carriage without anyone else. They'd both be ruined forever, you know, and not admitted inside Ullathorne gates, I should imagine, after such an impropriety. Of course, that wouldn't do, said Eleanor, but I couldn't go in the carriage with the Signora and your brother? Impossible, said Charlotte. When she is there is only room for two. The Signora, in truth, did not care to do her traveling in the presence of strangers, so Eleanor might have fit. Well then, said Eleanor, you are all so kind, Charlotte, and so good to me. I'm sure you won't be offended, but I think I shall not go at all. Not go at all? What nonsense! Indeed you shall. It had been absolutely determined in family council that Bertie should propose on that very occasion. So of course she has to go. He's going to propose marriage to her at this party at the Ullathornes. Or I can take a fly, said Eleanor. You know I am not embarrassed by so many difficulties as you young ladies. I can go alone. Nonsense, my dear. Don't think of such a thing. After all, it is only for an hour or so, and to tell the truth, I don't know what it is you dislike so. I thought you and Mr. Slope were great friends. What is it you dislike? Oh, nothing particular, said Eleanor, only I thought it would be a family party. Of course it should be much nicer, much more snug, if Bertie could go with us. It is he that is badly treated. I can assure you he is much more afraid of Mr. Slope than you are. But you see, Madeline cannot go without him, and she, poor creature, goes out so seldom. I'm sure you don't begrudge her this, though her vagary does knock about our own little party a little. Of course, Eleanor made 1,000 protestations and uttered 1,000 hopes that Madeline should enjoy herself, and of course she had to give way and undertake to go in a carriage with Mr. Slope. In fact, she was driven either to do this or to explain why she would not do so. Now she could not bring herself to explain to Charlotte Stanhope all that had passed at Plumstead. But it was to her a sore necessity. She thought of 1,000 little schemes for avoiding it. She would plead illness, and not go at all. She would persuade Marylebone to go, although not asked, and then make a necessity of having a carriage of her own to take her sister-in-law. Anything, in fact, she could do, rather than be seen by Mr. Arabin getting out of the same carriage with Mr. Slope. However, when the momentous morning came, she had no scheme matured, and then Mr. Slope handed her into Dr. Stanhope's carriage, and following her steps, sat opposite her. She never seems to be able to make herself clear on the subject of Mr. Slope. Never. She'll have to wear a sign. The bishop returned on the eve of the Ullathorne party, and was received at home with radiant smiles by the partner of all his cares. She didn't want him to go. She's all smiles when he comes back, because she is superior to all. On his arrival, he crept up to his dressing room with somewhat palpitating heart. He had overstayed his allotted time by 3 days, and was not without much fear of penalties. Nothing, however, could be more affectionately cordial than the greeting he received. The girls came out and kissed him in a manner that was quite soothing to his spirit, and Mrs. Proudie, albeit unused to the melting mood, squeezed him in her arms, and almost in words called him her dear, darling, good, pet, little bishop. All this was very pleasant surprise. Mrs. Proudie had somewhat changed her tactics. Not that she had any cause to disapprove of her former line of conduct, but she had now brought matters to such a point that she calculated that she might safely do so. She had got the better of Mr. Slope, and she now thought well to show her husband that when allowed to get the better of everybody, when obeyed by him and permitted to rule over others, she would take care that he should have his reward. Stop that. Stop that. She just starts methodically licking and is unconscious while she's doing it. She just doesn't stop. Once you stop her, she just doesn't stop. Mr. Slope had not a chance against her. Not only could she turn the bishop by her midnight anger, but she could assuage and soothe him, if she so willed, by daily indulgences. She could furnish his room for him, turn him out as smart as any bishop on the bench, give him good dinners, warm fires, and an easy life. All this she would do if he would but be quietly obedient. But if not... To speak sooth, however, his sufferings on that dreadful night had been so poignant as to leave him little spirit for further rebellion. So we've already seen, we didn't see it, but that night has already happened. It only took one. It didn't take a large amount of visits to the bedroom for her to break his will. As soon as he addressed himself, she returned to his room. I hope you enjoyed yourself at the Archbishop's palace, said she, seating herself on one side of the fire while he remained in his armchair on the other, stroking the calves of his legs. It was the first time he had had a fire in his room since the summer, and it pleased him, for the good bishop loved to be warm and cozy. Yes, he said, he had enjoyed himself very much. Nothing could be more polite than the Archbishop, and Mrs. Archbishop had been equally charming. Mrs. Proudie was delighted to hear it. and having petted and fondled her little man sufficiently, she proceeded to business. "The poor dean is still alive," she said. Schrodinger's dean. "So I hear, so I hear. I'll go directly to the deanery after the breakfast tomorrow." "We are going to this party at Ullathorne tomorrow morning, my dear. We must be there very early, you know, by 12 o'clock. "Oh, well, I'll certainly call the next day." "Was much said about it at the Archbishop's palace?" "About what?" "Filling up the dean's place," said Mrs. Proudie. As she spoke, a spark of the wonted fire returned to her eye, and the bishop felt himself to be a little less comfortable than before. "Filling up the dean's place, that is, if the dean dies? Very little, my dear. It was mentioned, just mentioned." "And what did you say about it, Bishop?" "Why, I said that I thought, if, that is, should the dean die, that is, I said I thought..." As he went on stammering and floundering, he saw that his wife's eyes were fixed sternly on him. Why should he encounter such an evil for a man whom he loved so slightly as Mr. Slope? Why should he give up his enjoyments and his ease, such a dignity as might be allowed to him, to fight a losing battle for a chaplain? The chaplain, after all, if successful, would be as great a tyrant as his wife. Why fight at all? Why contend? Why be uneasy? For that moment he determined to fling Mr. Slope to the winds and take the goods the gods provided. Oh, ye of little faith. All his dreams of being independent of his wife, they're gone. That one night was sufficient to do it. And this interview is certainly going to put the capstone on it. "I am told," said Mrs. Proudie, speaking very slowly, "that Mr. Slope is looking to be the new dean." "Yes, certainly, I believe he is." "And what does the Archbishop say about that?" "Well, my dear, to tell the truth, I promised Mr. Slope to speak to the Archbishop. Mr. Slope spoke about it to me. It is very arrogant of him, I must say, but that is nothing to me." "Arrogant," said Mrs. Proudie. "It is the most impudent piece of pretension I have ever heard in my life. Mr. Slope, Dean of Barchester, indeed. What did you do in the matter, Bishop?" Breath on my ear. Are we going to get some Frieda yoga? Oh, we are. Oh, goodness gracious. Ooh. Oh, oh goodness. Frieda Victrix. All right, let's keep going here. "Why, my dear, I did speak to the Archbishop." "You don't mean to tell me that you are going to make yourself ridiculous by lending your name to such a preposterous attempt as this?" "Mr. Slope, Dean of Barchester, indeed!" And she tossed her head and put her arms akimbo with an air of confident defiance that made her husband quite sure that Mr. Slope would never be Dean of Barchester. In truth, Mrs. Proudie was all but invincible. Had she married Petruchio, it may be doubted whether that arch wife-tamer would have been able to keep her legs out of those garments which are presumed by men to be peculiarly unfitted for feminine use. That's a Shakespearean allusion. We're also getting an allusion to Greek tragedy here. It is preposterous, my dear." "Then why have you endeavored to assist him?" "Why, my dear, I haven't assisted him much." "But why have you done it at all? Why have you mixed your name up in anything so ridiculous? What was it you did say to the Archbishop?" "Why, I just did mention it. I just did say that in the event of the poor dean's death, Mr. Slope would what? I forget how I put it. Would take it if he could get it. Something of that sort. I didn't say much after that." "You shouldn't have said anything at all. What did the Archbishop say?" "He didn't say anything. He just bowed and rubbed his hands. Somebody else came up at that moment, and as we were discussing the new parochial universal school committee, the matter of the dean dropped. After that, I didn't think it wise to renew it." "Renew it? I am very sorry you ever mentioned it. What will the Archbishop think of you?" "You may be sure, my dear, the Archbishop thought very little about it." "But why did you think about it, Bishop? How could you think of making such a creature as that Dean of Barchester? Dean of Barchester! I suppose he'll be looking for a bishopric some of these days. A man that hardly knows who his own father was. A man that I found without bread to his mouth or a coat to his back. Dean of Barchester, indeed. I'll dean him." Mrs. Proudie considered herself to be in politics a pure Whig. All her family belonged to the Whig party. Now, among all the ranks of Englishmen and Englishwomen, Mrs. Proudie, I think, should be ranked among the former for the strength of her great mind. No one is so hostile to lowly-born pretenders to high station as the pure Whig. The bishop thought it necessary to exculpate himself. Why, my dear, it appeared to me that you and Mr. Slope did not get on quite so well as you used to. Get on? Said Mrs. Proudie, moving her foot uneasily on the hearthrug and compressing her lips in a manner that betokened much danger on the subject of their discourse. I began to find that he was objectionable to you. Mrs. Proudie's foot worked on the hearthrug with great rapidity, and that you would be more comfortable if he was out of the palace. Mrs. Proudie smiled, as a hyena may smile, probably before he begins his laugh. And therefore I thought that if he got this place, and so ceased to be my chaplain, you might be pleased at such an arrangement. And then the hyena laughed out loud. Pleased at such an arrangement. Pleased at having her enemy converted into a dean at 1,200 a year. Medea, that's a figure from Greek tragedy. When she describes the customs of her native country, I am quoting from the Robson edition, thanks, Tony, assures her astonished auditor that in her land captives, when taken, are eaten. You pardon them, says Medea. We do indeed, says the mild Grecian. We eat them, said she of Colchis with terrific energy. Mrs. Proudie was the Medea of Barchester. No arguments here. She had no idea of not eating Mr. Slope. Pardon him. Merely get rid of him. Make a dean of him. It was not so they did with their captives in her country among the people of her sort. Mr. Slope had no such mercy to expect. She would pick him to the very last bone. Oh, yes, my dear, of course he'll cease to be your chaplain, said she. After what has passed, that much is a matter of course. I couldn't for a moment think of living in the same house with such a man. Besides, he has shown himself quite unfit for such a situation, making broils and quarrels among the clergy, getting you, my dear, into scrapes, and taking upon himself as though he were as good as a bishop. Of course he'll go. But because he leaves the palace, that is not a reason why he should get into the deanery. Oh, of course not, said the bishop, but to save appearances, you know, my dear. I don't want to save appearances. I want Mr. Slope to appear just as he is, a false, designing, mean, intriguing man. I have my eye on him. He little knows what I see. He knows about Signor Neroni. She knows all about that. He is misconducting himself in the most disgraceful way with that lame Italian woman. Madeline Neroni is Madeline Vesey Stanhope. She is not Italian any more than Mrs. Proudie is. That family is a disgrace to Barchester, and Mr. Slope is a disgrace to Barchester. If he doesn't look well to it, he'll have his gown stripped off his back instead of on a dean's hat on his head. Dean, indeed. The man has gone mad with arrogance. The bishop said nothing further to excuse him, either himself or his chaplain, and having shown himself passive and docile, he was again taken into favor. They soon went to dinner, and he spent the pleasantest evening he had had in his own house for a long time. His daughter played and sang to him as he sipped his coffee and read his newspaper, and Mrs. Proudie asked good-natured little questions about the archbishop. And then he went happily to bed, and slept as quietly as though Mrs. Proudie had been Griselda herself. While shaving himself in the morning and preparing for the festivities at Ullathorne, he fully resolved to run no more tilts against a warrior so fully armed at all points as was Mrs. Proudie. And that is chapter 33, in which we learn that Mrs. Proudie was never going to lose this battle. She lost that one horrible scene with Mr. Slope that you'll remember, where she says very pointedly to her husband, "Will you tell this man to leave the room so that I can speak with you in private?" And her husband says no. She has to leave instead. Nothing was ever going to be forgiven after that. Mr. Slope was always doomed after that. The one thing we know two main things in this chapter. Mr. Slope has taken an enormous gamble, whether he knows it or not. He has taken an enormous gamble. He has alienated the woman to whom he owes his position as the bishop's chaplain, while at the same time not having the guarantee of the deanery. He's asked the bishop for help, he's asked an editor for help, and he's asked a politician for help. And so far has received no help from any of those quarters. He isn't sure what's going to happen. He isn't actually even sure that the dean will die, much less die in a timely fashion. So we see in this chapter that we know something now that Mr. Slope doesn't know, which is that he's not going to be the bishop's chaplain, no matter what happens with the deanery. So there's all sorts of uncertainty in the air, but we know that this big gathering at Ullathorne is coming up. Surely there'll be fireworks there of all kinds. So we'll move on from there next time. I don't seem to be able to get these done in under 30 minutes, but that's because of all the interruptions. We're going to keep forging ahead with this book. So we'll go to the next chapter next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.